just on these more immediate disruptions, we heard on the last episode of the Freight Buyers Club about huge numbers of blank sailings into the US, factories in China being abandoned, cargo not being collected at US ports. We're also seeing this mad cap dash to get cargo out of Southeast Asia during a 90-day tariff window pause for many of those countries before we might see more higher tariffs coming in later in the year. Can you explain to listeners a little bit about how carriers are responding to all this chaos and these new barriers to trade and these deadline cliff edges that we're seeing?
Yeah, so I think, first what you highlight, sometimes it gets lost when you talk about ocean carriers, but we serve the trade. Shippers are our customers, and our customers who are shippers have basically looked at 145% tariffs coming into the US and 125% going back to China, and put a lot of that trade in suspense until some other resolution comes out because it's just too expensive. So there's been a lot of adjustments on that network. I'd invite your listeners to look closely at the excellent statistics that the Port of Los Angeles and Port of Long Beach put up. But it is a drop off, and so you do have to respond to that. Now, you also mentioned, some of the other areas in Asia, like Vietnam, where those tariffs are in suspense, at least the larger ones. Obviously, shippers are trying to rush in cargo before the other shoe drops, and those tariffs go back into effect at very high rates. And that's just, they're just responding to the behavior signals that the U.S. administration is putting out there, frankly.
During the pandemic, Joe, we saw how easily global container shipping can break when the system gets continually disrupted. We get ships stuck in the wrong port, containers pile up where they're not needed. If you throw in what we've got at the moment, which is unpredictable new tariff rules, port fees, possibly regulatory changes, is there a real risk that we could be setting ourselves up for another reliability crisis, or even some sort of whiplash effect that we saw during the pandemic if things change really quite dramatically again, maybe reverting back to no tariffs for just as one scenario? Because in the pandemic, the container carriers got hammered for things like detention and demurrage fees, but it wasn't always their fault. They were at the whims of supply and demand.
Yeah, I'm glad you recognize that. It's important to remind listeners that, when we think back to that terrible time in November of 2021 in the midst of the pandemic, when there were over 100 large container liners stranded off the ports of Southern California, there was plenty of container liner capacity. It's just the ports couldn't process all the cargo that was being ordered, and that's where the bottleneck occurred. So hopefully we've gotten a little better at that. So I don't see a reliability crisis as much. And in fact, unfortunately, if the volumes in the ports have dropped off as much as the ports are reporting, there is plenty of capacity. I do, on the other hand, see a risk of a whiplash effect because the zigging and the zagging and the ever-changing policies, like I said, shippers are trying to respond to those to serve their customers. We're trying to respond to those to serve shippers. And when you surge supply and demand like that based on inputs that aren't market driven, you definitely risk a whiplash effect.